General Hospital spoilers reveal that too many truths unraveled in a single afternoon at the most unlikely of places, Willow and Drew's wedding. What was supposed to be a moment of redemption, healing, and unity for two people scarred by loss and betrayal quickly devolved into a public unraveling of control, secrets, and long-simmering resentment. Port Charles had seen its fair share of chaos. But nothing could have prepared the guests, or the bride and groom, for how violently this day would shift the trajectory of every life present. In one afternoon, the illusion of peace was shattered. The facade of civility ripped apart, and a new chapter of dangerous storytelling began, where power, control, and truth collided with such force that not even the strongest alliances could withstand it. The venue was immaculate, decorated with care, a symbol of hope after so much destruction. Willow stood radiant, her heart still cautiously open, trusting in the second chance she had offered Drew. Drew, in turn, appeared composed and hopeful, at least on the surface. But inside him, something was cracking. The pressure of hidden truths, the weight of being complicit in things he no longer wished to protect, and the rising realization that the man he had once allied with, Sidwell, was far more dangerous than anyone realized, all became too much to contain. Drew had hoped to keep the peace, to keep the day sacred for Willow's sake. But the fire inside him was too strong. As the ceremony began, so did the undercurrents of tension. Carly, seated quietly but watchful, already sensed something wasn't right. Michael's eyes flickered with concern as he observed Drew's rigid posture. Even Jason, lurking nearby in case trouble found them, as it so often did, could feel it, a storm was brewing. And then, in one breathless moment, it erupted. Drew stepped forward, breaking the flow of the ceremony. His voice, firm and deliberate, cut through the soft music and polite whispers. He announced that he could no longer pretend. That something bigger than his own happiness needed to be confronted. And then, with the eyes of everyone locked on him, he named Sidwell. The room froze. Drew spoke not with emotion, but with conviction, dangerous, sobering conviction. He exposed Sidwell's manipulations over the last several months, connecting him to the cover-up of the penthouse fire that injured Michael, and suggesting that Sidwell's influence had seeped into far more corners of Port Charles than anyone had suspected. Drew detailed conversations, financial records, intercepted messages, all of which painted a picture not just of a man working from the shadows, but of a puppeteer pulling strings behind major events. He accused Sidwell of leveraging personal trauma, weaponizing secrecy, and creating conflict to keep everyone unstable and dependent on him. Sidwell, caught off guard and for the first time visibly rattled, tried to interrupt. He claimed Drew was having an emotional breakdown, that grief and stress were warping his perception. But the crowd was already listening to Drew. The momentum had shifted. Even those once in Sidwell's corner were now silent, calculating, afraid they too had been manipulated. Carly stood slowly, her gaze locked on Sidwell, horror dawning in her eyes as she realized that the subtle inconsistencies, the near misses, the odd silences in recent months all now made a disturbing kind of sense. Willow was stunned. She had come into the wedding already emotionally conflicted, but this? To learn that her new husband had been holding this storm inside, choosing their wedding day to unleash it, left her breathless. She didn't know whether to run, scream, or fall into Drew's arms. Michael was livid, not at Drew, but at how deeply they had all been played. He stood between Willow and the growing tension, already preparing for whatever retaliation might follow. And retaliation did follow. Sidwell, though shaken, made it clear the war had begun. He warned Drew, publicly, that what he had started couldn't be undone. That by exposing these truths, he had not only turned Sidwell into a target but made himself vulnerable to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. But Drew didn't flinch. He stood there, shoulder squared, daring Sidwell to try. It wasn't just bravery, it was defiance. It was the act of a man who had been broken, manipulated, nearly destroyed, and was now reclaiming his voice. In that moment, The entire narrative of Port Charles shifted. The wedding was no longer about vows or love. It was about power. About who controls truth. About who gets to rewrite the future. The ceremony ended not with a kiss but with silence, tension, and people scattering in small groups, some shaken, some enraged, some secretly thrilled at the new war taking shape. Back at the mansion, Jason and Carly debriefed in quiet panic. They knew Drew had detonated a bomb that couldn't be contained. They needed to decide quickly how to protect Michael and Willow. How to shield themselves from Sidwell's inevitable counterattack, and how to finally dismantle whatever hidden web Sidwell had been spinning. Meanwhile, Sidwell vanished from the public eye, retreating into his private network, already preparing for his next move. But the damage was done. Port Charles was no longer operating under the same rules. The exposure of Sidwell's control. The betrayal wrapped inside a celebration, and the fallout from Drew's public rebellion had unleashed something that could not be reversed. Truth had escaped its cage, and it was hungry. And in the quiet hours after the chaos, as Willow sat alone in her wedding dress, staring at the shattered remains of a future she thought she understood, only one thought remained. Everything is different now. The lines have been redrawn. And the fight for control, of love, family, and truth, has only just begun. If Sonny finally learns the full extent of what Sidwell and Brennan have done, the fires they set, the blood they spilled, the psychological destruction they inflicted on the people he loves most, then Port Charles is no longer just on the edge of chaos. It has already fallen into the eye of a storm. This isn't just another round in Sonny's long war against enemies of the Corinthos name. This is personal. Raw. Final. Because now, Sonny isn't just reacting, he's hunting. And what lies ahead is not negotiation, not diplomacy, but a calculated, brutal pursuit of justice. What has begun is Sonny's last war. The truth comes to him in pieces. Drew's outburst at the wedding, Jason's quiet confirmations, Carly's unraveling memories, and Michael's haunted silence. Each fragment cuts deeper than the last. Sonny realizes, with sickening clarity, that Brennan and Sidwell were never separate threats. They were working together, two sides of a meticulously planned takedown. They didn't just target him. They targeted his family. Michael was almost killed. Carly was emotionally manipulated. Jason was distracted. And Drew, unknowingly or not, played right into their hands. They broke through Sonny's inner circle using deceit, fire, and fear. But now Sonny sees it. All of it. And the moment he does, something inside him changes. Not with explosive rage, but with terrifying stillness. The calm before annihilation. For years, Sonny has been pulled back from the edge by his love for his children, his code. His inner desire to rebuild something peaceful in the ashes of his old life. But this crosses every line he's drawn in the sand. The rules are gone. The gloves are off. The war has begun. Not for territory. Not for power. But for vengeance. Word begins to spread in hushed tones across Port Charles. Sonny is moving again. The old Sonny. The one who doesn't sleep, who doesn't hesitate. The one who hunts. Sidwell and Brennan are no longer adversaries, they're marked men. Targets. Ghosts in waiting. And Sonny, with Jason at his side, begins tracking them with surgical precision. Every safe house, every ally, every resource they thought they had is cut off. One by one, their shadows are erased. Their power diminishes. And the noose tightens. Brennan is found first. Hiding in a coastal property under a false name, he thinks he's far enough away to regroup, to disappear. He's wrong. Sonny doesn't confront him with theatrics, he walks into the room like a man possessed by clarity. Brennan tries to talk, to offer explanations, perhaps even strike a deal. But Sonny says nothing. Because there is nothing left to say. A single gunshot rings out, cold and final. Brennan falls, and with him, part part of the darkness that hovered over Sonny's family is extinguished. But Sidwell is different. Sidwell was the architect. The puppeteer. The mind behind the madness. And Sonny knows that to kill Sidwell is not just to take a life, it is to end an era. He tracks Sidwell not to punish, but to finish. To close the chapter. To reclaim control over a life that's been slipping further and further into the hands of others. When he finds him, hidden in plain sight, perhaps even still pretending to be a concerned citizen, Sonny gives him no warning. No trial. No conversation. What Sidwell did to Michael, to Willow, to Carly, cannot be forgiven. The bullet that ends him isn't justice. It's a warning to anyone else who thinks they can come for the Corinthos family. And just like that, it's over. Brennan and Sidwell, two names once whispered in fear, now carved into the past. Dead. Gone. Erased by the hands of a man who could no longer tolerate mercy. But Sonny knows what comes next. The world won't stop turning. There will be consequences. Questions. Silence. And in that silence, he makes a decision. This was the last war. The final retaliation. Sonny begins preparing to step down. Not in shame. Not in exile. But in victory. Because this was the battle he had to fight. The one where he reminded Port Charles, and the world, who he is. What he protects. And what happens when you cross his family. In the aftermath, as the city slowly exhales, the people closest to Sonny sense it. The war is over, but the man is changed. Jason respects the decision. Carly, though still reeling from the emotional carnage, understands. Michael, broken but healing, feels safe again. And Willow, watching the man who once stood so coldly on the sidelines now move to protect without hesitation, finally sees the kind of strength no one else ever dared wield. Sonny walks away from it all with blood on his hands, but with peace in his soul. The thread is gone. The balance restored. And though he may never fully be free of what he's done, he knows one thing with absolute certainty: his family will never again be unprotected. Because in the end, Sonny Corinthos didn't just end Brennan and Sidwell. He buried the war itself. Sonny had long been the shadowed pillar of Port Charles, a man who ruled not from behind a desk, but from the edges of power, with grit, loyalty, and the kind of unrelenting force that made enemies tremble and allies rise. For decades, he protected what mattered most, his family. But after eliminating Brennan and Sidwell with precise and final brutality, two men who dared to strike at his blood, manipulate his trust, and dismantle the very foundation of his world, Sonny knew something irreversible had occurred. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era. His era. He stood over the wreckage not as a man seeking more, but as a man ready to let go. He had won every war he ever needed to win, and in doing so, had realized that holding on to the crown was no longer strength, it was a burden. The fire in him hadn't faded, but its direction had changed. And so, with clarity that only came from having nothing left to prove, Sonny stepped down. He handed over the empire he'd bled for, not to strangers or unworthy heirs, but to his blood, Michael. Michael had always lived in conflict, raised in privilege, shaped by pain, and constantly balancing two worlds. For years, he resisted his darker lineage, choosing boardrooms over back alleys. Justice over vengeance. But the events with Brennan and Sidwell broke something open in him. Watching his mother be manipulated, watching Willow suffer, nearly dying in the penthouse fire, it changed Michael. He saw firsthand what happened when power fell into the wrong hands, when lines blurred, and when no one stood strong enough to defend what mattered. So when Sonny offered him the throne, not out of desperation, but out of choice, Michael took it. But he would rule differently. He dismantled the old structures with clinical precision. Gone were the emotional deals, the favors owed in blood. Michael rebranded the organization, folding its assets into legitimate fronts, international holdings, and silent partnerships. He didn't need to be feared in the traditional sense, he needed to be untouchable. Under Michael, the Corinthos name became a whisper not just in Port Charles, but in boardrooms and political circles across the country. He wasn't a mobster. He was a strategist, a king in a suit, reshaping power in a digital, economic world. And then came Jocelyn. Jocelyn's transformation was less expected, but infinitely more powerful. For years, she had been the idealist. The one who believed in justice, in light, in doing things the right way. But as she watched her family fall apart, as she saw Nina's betrayal, Drew's lies, and Michael nearly die, something inside her hardened. She stopped waiting for someone to fix things. She became the one who would. When the WSB approached her with an offer, initially as a liaison, then as a consultant, she surprised even herself by accepting. What started as cautious curiosity became a relentless rise through the agency ranks. Jocelyn didn't just adapt, she dominated. She exposed corruption, ousted compromised agents, and in less than a year, took over as the youngest director the WSB had ever seen. And she did it without breaking a single rule. Or at least, not openly. Because what no one outside the family understood was this: Michael and Jocelyn weren't operating on separate fronts. They were coordinating. Strategically. Silently. She in control of international intelligence, he in control of domestic power and capital. And between them, there was no place left for enemies to hide. While Michael neutralized threats with economic ruin and quiet influence, Jocelyn ensured those threats never resurfaced, legally or otherwise. The Corinthos family didn't just maintain power after Sonny retired, they evolved it. Their reach extended into global institutions. Their name no longer represented violence, but omnipresence. And yet, beneath the polished surface, the fire still burned. Because what Sonny had passed down was more than control, it was instinct. It was an unshakable loyalty to family. And a ruthless refusal to be outmaneuvered. Port Charles felt the shift almost immediately. Old enemies vanished. The balance of power shifted. Jason, still loyal, became the silent enforcer in Michael's world. Carly, though no longer in the center of the storm, remained a voice of counsel behind both Michael and Jocelyn. Even Ava and Nina, once tangled in drama and manipulation, found themselves sidelined by a younger, more focused generation of Corinthos power. Sonny watched all of it from the distance of retirement. But this wasn't peace. It was legacy. He had built the fire, they had forged it into steel. And though he had stepped away, everyone still knew, Sonny hadn't lost anything. He had multiplied it. Because Michael and Jocelyn were no longer heirs. They were kings and queens of their own making. And the world would never be the same again. The story of 3 deaths, Sonny, Sidwell, and Brennan, has cast a long, dark shadow over Port Charles. What was once a city ruled by quiet deals and underground alliances is now engulfed in something far more haunting. An all-consuming obsession with power, vengeance, and control. These deaths weren't just the fall of 3 men, they were the collapse of an entire era. And now, as the dust settles, a chilling realization sets in: Port Charles is no longer what it used to be. It is a city haunted by loss, stained by betrayal, and shaken to its very core. And nothing, not love, not law, not loyalty, has been left untouched. Brennan was the first to fall. A calculated manipulator operating from within the shadows, his sins had grown too loud to remain hidden. He orchestrated fires, fed lies, and nearly killed Michael in a twisted scheme meant to destabilize Sonny's world. But Brennan miscalculated one thing: how far Sonny would go once his family was threatened. Brennan didn't die quietly. His death was violent, unmerciful, the culmination of years spent crossing invisible lines. It was justice, but it was also a signal. Something darker had been awakened. Sidwell was next. Unlike Brennan, Sidwell operated with surgical precision, hiding behind masks of civility and influence. He wasn't interested in chaos, he wanted control. He believed in systems. Manipulation, slow decay. But in trying to manipulate Drew, target Willow, and poison the Corinthos legacy from within, Sidwell signed his own death warrant. The moment Drew exposed him at Willow's wedding, the countdown began. His death didn't come in an alleyway, it came in silence, after a confrontation with Sonny that was never meant for witnesses. No one cried. No one questioned. Because everyone knew, Sidwell had earned what he got. But no death shook the foundation of Port Charles like Sonny's. Some say it was planned, a final move by a man who had already given everything. Others believe it was the price he paid for living in a world where blood always demanded more blood. Whether he died in a final act of vengeance or was taken down by someone who wanted to end the Corinthos dynasty for good, one truth remains. When Sonny fell, the city trembled. His death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the collapse of the myth that Sonny was untouchable. It was grief wrapped in fear. Power drowned in silence. Now, with all three men gone, Port Charles is a city lost in its own reflection. The streets are tense. Conversations are cautious. Everyone's watching, waiting, wondering who will rise and who will fall next. But beneath the surface, something far more terrifying brews: obsession. The obsession to find the truth behind Sonny's death. The obsession to preserve his legacy. The obsession to make sense of the wreckage that Brennan and Sidwell left behind. Jocelyn walks with a sharper edge. Michael speaks with fewer words and colder eyes. Jason, once the silent guardian, now watches everyone, trusting no one. The old rules no longer apply. The people left behind aren't looking to restore peace, they're looking to redefine it. And in doing so, they carry the ghosts of all three men with them. Every choice they make is haunted. Every alliance they forge is unstable. Every corner of the city now whispers with unfinished business. Because Port Charles didn't just lose three powerful men, it gained three eternal shadows. And those shadows are growing. What comes next isn't just about who takes the throne or who fills the void. It's about how long the city can survive the weight of so much death, so much obsession, and the irreversible truth that nothing, and no one, is safe anymore. The fire has already started. And Port Charles is burning.